So here we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations. Quadratic equations means that the highest exponent is 2 with our variable. So the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So in order to solve these equations using the quadratic formula, we need to make sure that we place the terms in descending order and set the equation equal to 0. The quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus. It's plus or minus because we have two solutions because our exponent is 2 times the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Notice that the fraction bar is under the entire numerator and 2a, the denominator, is under the entire thing. Okay, so let's look at one and how to use the quadratic formula to solve. So the quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic equation. If it's factorable, you can use it, and if it's not factorable, you can use it. Whereas when we had solving quadratic equations in the past, we could only do it by factoring, and all of those were factorable. So remember that the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So what we want to do is identify what a is, b is, and c is so that we can plug those into our quadratic formula. So a is our coefficient of our x squared term. So since in this case we have 1x squared, we're going to substitute 1 in for a. B is the coefficient of our x term, and in this case, since we have 1x, b is also positive 1, and c is our constant. In this case, our constant is a negative 8. So we're going to take those values and simply plug them into the quadratic formula and simplify. So we have x equals the opposite of b. In this case, b is 1, so the opposite is negative 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So when I multiply b times itself, I get 1 minus 4. It's always minus 4 because that's a part of our formula, times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 8. And this is all over 2 times a, which in this case is 1. Now we simplify. Negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1. Now when we're doing this part underneath the radical sign, the way I do it is I start with saying negative 4 times 1, which is negative 4. That answer times negative 8. So negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, and negative 4 times negative 8 is positive 32. And that's all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Now I'm going to combine like terms underneath the radical sign. 1 plus 32 is 33, and my denominator is 2. Now, what I do next is I see if I can simplify 33 in this case. The square root of 33 does not have any perfect square factors, so that cannot be simplified. I also look to see if I can reduce the fraction. In order to reduce, something needs to be able to go into the denominator, 2, the first term, negative 1, and the coefficient of your radical, which in this case is 1. So since nothing, with the exception of 1, divides into all three of these, that's my final answer. So I have the two answers, negative 1 plus square root of 33 over 2, and negative 1 minus the square root of 33 over 2. My next example, solved by the quadratic formula. So again, I need to identify a, b, and c. So I know that a in this case is 4, B in this case is 3, and C in this case is -8. So I need to plug that into my quadratic formula. So it's a good idea if for each problem, until you have it memorized, that you rewrite the quadratic formula. So it's x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So now I'm going to substitute in the values. So the first thing I do is substitute 3 in for b. So the opposite of b, the opposite of 3 is -3 plus or minus the square root. B squared means I just take b and multiply it times itself. So 3 times 3 is 9 minus 4 times a in this case is 4 times c in this case is -8. And that's all over 2 times, in this case, 4. So my next step is to go ahead and start simplifying what's underneath the radical sign. So what I need to do is take -4 times 4, which is -16, and then I take -16 times -8, and that gives me positive 128. So I have 9. Since it's a positive 128, I write plus 128. If it were a negative 128, I'd write minus 128 over 2 times 4, which is 8. Continue to simplify by combining like terms. And my last steps would be to simplify this if possible. There are no perfect square factors of 137, so I can't simplify that. And nothing divides into -3, 8, and 1 with the exception of 1. So that would be my final answer. -3 plus or minus 137, or the square root of 137 in this case, over 8. Okay, another example. So here we have a quadratic equation, 3x squared plus 1x minus 2 equals 0. So since we're using the quadratic formula, the first thing that you want to do is write down what a equals. In this case, it's 3. B equals, in this case, positive 1. And C equals -2. And again, a good idea, write out the quadratic formula. Best way to memorize it is to continue to write it down problem after problem. And now plug in the value. So we have the opposite of b. So b in this case is positive 1. So we have x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of b times itself. So 1 times 1 is 1 minus 4 times a, which in this case is 3, times c, which in this case is -2. And this is all over 2 times a, and a in this case is 3. Continue to simplify. We have -1 plus or minus the square root of 1. And remember, when I'm doing the multiplication, I start with the -4 times 3, which is -12. And -12 times -2 is positive 24 all over 6. Combine my like terms underneath the radical sign. So I get -1 plus or minus square root of 25 all over 6. Now I see if I can simplify. Well, 25 we know is a perfect square. So I can simplify the square root of 25 to simply be 5. So I'd have -1 plus or minus 5, not underneath the radical sign, because the square root of 25 is 5 all over 6. Now, since both of these terms are like, I'm going to set it up and do 2 separate problems. One is -1 plus 5 over 6, and my other answer is -1 minus 5 over 6. So -1 plus 5 is 4 over 6, which reduces to 2/3. For my other answer, -1 minus 5 is -6 over 6, which reduces to -1. So my two answers would be 2/3 and -1. So anytime my numbers come out to be rational without radical signs, then that means the problem could have been factored in the first place. So if all else fails and you're not sure whether something can be factored or not, just use the quadratic formula. It will always work. Now we're getting into solving equations, and then we're going to use the quadratic formula to help us solve. So just as we did in the past, in this case, we have 1 over, and I put it in parentheses, x plus 2 plus 1 over x equals 1 over 4. So what I'm going to do, just as we did in the past, is multiply each term by the LCD. In this case, the LCD is going to be 4x times x plus 2. So I'm multiplying each term by 4x times x plus 2. So this would be 1 over x plus 2 times 4x times x plus 2 plus 1 over x times 4x times x plus 2 equals 1 over 4 times 4x times the quantity x plus 2. So what we're going to do is reduce. So for the first, the x plus 2 is reduced, leaving us 1 times 4x, which is simply 4x. For the second term, the x is reduced, leaving us 1 times 4, which is 4, and we're going to distribute that times the x plus 2, and that gives us 4x plus 8. And then the last, the 4 is reduced, leaving us x times the quantity x plus 2, so we distribute. So x times x is x squared, and x times positive 2 is positive 2x. So what you're going to do is combine your like terms first. So 4x and 4x gives me 8x plus 8 equals x squared plus 2x. Remember, whenever we're using the quadratic formula, we want to set it equal to 0. Now, some people are inclined to move the x squared from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. In doing so, it's going to change your coefficient to a negative. I usually like to deal with, although there's no rule for this, I like to leave my x squared as positive. So what I'm going to do is subtract 8x from both sides and 8 from both sides. So minus 8x and minus 8. So on the left-hand side, that leaves me 0, and that's what I want. And on the right-hand side, that leaves me x squared, and I have 2x minus 8x, which is minus 6x, and then I have a minus 8. So what I'm going to do now is use the quadratic formula to solve. So in order to do that, I identify my a, b, and c. So in this case, a is 1, b is -6, and c is -8. So I'm going to plug that into the quadratic formula. So remember the quadratic formula, x equals the opposite of b. So in this case, b is -6, so this becomes 6, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So -6 times -6 is positive 36, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is -8, all over 2 times a, or 2 times 1. So this would give me 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. And remember, we start with that -4 times 1 is -4. -4 times -8 is positive 32, all over 2. So now we combine like terms. And this gives us 6 plus or minus the square root of 78 all over 2. So keep in mind, whenever we come to this step, we may need to simplify further. So in this case, we know that 78 can be broken down. So we have 6 plus or minus. Now 78 can be broken down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 17. I'm sorry, there should be 68. All over 2. And so square root of 4 is 2. So we have 6 plus or minus 2 square roots of 17 all over 2. And now, since something divides into all 3 of these, I can divide it out. So 2 goes into 2 one time, into 6 3 times, and into 2 one time. So our final answer is simply going to be 3 plus or minus the square root of 17. Okay, so again, sorry about that up here. This should be 68, not 78. And so we broke 68 into the square root of 4 times the square root of 17. Okay. Our next example is exactly the same. So what we're dealing with is fractions in an equation. So we're going to find the LCD. So the LCD in this case is going to be 2y times y plus 3. So we're going to multiply each one of those terms by our common denominator. So here we have 1 over 2 times 2y times y plus 3 plus 1 over y times our LCD, which is 2y times y plus 3. That equals 6 over y plus 3 times our LCD, which is 2y times y plus 3. So for the first, the 2's reduce, and that leaves us y times y plus 3, which is y squared plus 3y. In the second term, the y's reduce, and that leaves us 1 times 2, which is 2, and we distribute the 2 times the y plus 3, and that gives us 2y plus 6 equals, in this case, the y plus 3's reduce. That leaves us 6 times 2y, which is simply 12y. So we're going to combine our like terms. So here we have y squared plus 5y plus 6 equals 12y. And remember, we're going to subtract 12y from both sides. And this gives us y squared minus 7y plus 6 equals 0. Okay, so again, identify A equals 1, B equals negative 7, and C equals positive 6. So we plug that into our quadratic formula. So x equals the opposite of b. So the opposite of negative 7 is positive 7, plus or minus the square root. B times itself, so negative 7 times negative 7 is positive 49, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So that'd be 7 plus or minus the square root of 49. Now here we have, remember, start with negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, and negative 4 times 6 is negative 24 all over 2. So this gives us 7 plus or minus the square root of 25 all over 2. So again, we simplify. So we know the square root of 25 is 5. So here we'd have 7 plus or minus 5 all over 2. Remember what I said before, that since we can combine these, we want to write it as 2 separate problems in order to simplify. 7 plus 5 over 2 and 7 minus 5 over 2. So 7 plus 5 is 12, and 12 over 2 is 6. And 7 minus 5 is 2, and 2 over 2 is 1. So our two answers would be 6 and 1. Again, since these came out to be rational numbers, no radicals, that means this problem could have been factored in the first place. Our next example, we have solve 4x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. So it's already in its standard form, so we identify a equals 4, b equals negative 6, and c equals 3. So we put it in our quadratic formula. So x equals the opposite of b. So the opposite of negative 6 is positive 6, plus or minus square root of b squared. So negative 6 times negative 6 is 36, minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is 3, all over 2 times a, which in this case is 4. So this would give us 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. Now we have negative 4 times 4, which is negative 16, and negative 16 times 3 is negative 48, all over 2 times 4, which is 8. So this gives us 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 12 over 8. Now, we have a negative underneath our radical sign. So remember, we're going to use I to simplify. So now what we're going to do is simplify, and this would be the same thing as 6 plus or minus I. 12 can be broken down to the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 all over 8. So the square root of 4 is 2, so we get 6 plus or minus square root of 4 is 2, so we write 2i square roots of 3 over 8. And remember, we can reduce if something divides into the 2, the 6, and the 8. Since 2 divides into all of these, we divide each by 2. So our final answer would be 3 plus or minus. You don't have to write the 1 in front of the I, that's understood. So 3 plus or minus I square roots of 3 all over 4. Our last problems are word problems. So we're going to be using factoring or the quadratic formula to solve these. So what I'm going to do is help you set these up. So the area of a rectangle. So we know the formula for area. Area equals length times width. Now it gives us a relationship between the length and the width. So in this case, it says its length. So let's go ahead and just write length and width on our drawing. So it says in place of length, it says its length is 8 feet longer than twice its width. So in place of L, it is 8 feet longer than twice. So twice the width is 2W plus 8, because it says 8 feet longer. So it says the area. So remember, to find the area, we're going to multiply these two together. So the width times 2 times the width plus 8 is going to equal, in this case, 234. So again, in place of length, we put in the relationship. It said in place of length, the length is 8 feet longer than twice the width. So now we distribute. So W times 2W is 2W squared. W times 8 is 8W, and that gives us 234. Now keep in mind, anytime you're solving an equation, what you do to one side, you do to the other. In this case, to make life easier on you, you notice that 2, 8, and 234 are even numbers. So what I would do to make life easier is to divide everything by 2. So this would give me W squared plus 4W equals, in this case, we're dividing each by 2, so 117. So in order to solve, we need to set it to 0. So I'm going to move the 117 from the right-hand side to the left-hand side by taking the opposite. Okay, so now we can use the shortcut. Remember, you can use the shortcut in order to factor when your leading coefficient is 1. So here we have W squared plus 4W minus 117. So we're looking for the factors of negative 117 that add to a 4. So we can put W and W. Since it's a negative, one of these has got to be positive, and the other one has to be negative. So the factors of 117 that give us a 4 would be 13 times 9. So 13 times 9 gives us 117, and positive 13 minus 9 gives us positive 4. So remember, we set each one of these to 0 to solve. So we have W plus 13 equals 0, and W minus 9 equals 0. So W would equal negative 13, or W would equal 9. Now, since W represents the width, when we measure, we don't have negative answers. So negative 13 would not be a solution. So we know our width is 9. So we know our width is 9, and based on our original problem, it said our length is twice the width plus 8. So we substitute 9 in for W. So we get 2 times 9 plus 8. So 2 times 9 is 18, and 18 plus 8 is 26. So our length is 26, and our width is 9. To check your answer, you simply multiply 9 times 26, and that should give you 234. So let's look at the last one, a similar problem. So in this case, though, we're dealing with a triangle. This is a triangular flag. So remember, the area of a triangle, area equals 1/2 the base times the altitude. So in this case, again, if you want to make a drawing, the altitude is the height. So it says the area of the triangular flag is 56 square meters. Its altitude is 2 centimeters long than twice its base. So here's the base. The altitude, the height, is 2 centimeters longer than twice the base. So that would be 2b plus 2. So when we're plugging it into our formula, we know that area, which in this case is 56, equals 1/2 the base times the altitude. Well, we just found the altitude to be 2 times the base plus 2. So as we did before in solving rational equations, the first thing that may make life easier on you is to get rid of this fraction. So multiply both sides by 2. So on the right-hand side, the 2's reduce, leaving us b times 2b plus 2. And on the left-hand side, 2 times 56 is 112. So we're going to distribute. So b times 2b is 2b squared, and b times 2 is simply 2b. So again, to make life easier on you, since all of these are even numbers, I'm going to divide everything by 2 to make my numbers smaller. So this gives me 56 equals b squared plus b. So remember, we need to set this to 0. So I'm going to move the 56 from the right-hand side to the left-hand side by taking its opposite. And now I'm going to factor. So the factors of negative 56 that add to a 1 would be a positive 8 and a negative 7. So keep in mind we set each one to 0. So we say b plus 8 equals 0 and b minus 7 equals 0. So when we move the 8 from the left-hand side to the right, that gives us b equals negative 8, which is not an acceptable answer because it's negative. Now when I add 7 to both sides, it tells me my base is 7. So again, keep in mind the relationship between the base and the altitude. It says the altitude, again, is 2 times the base plus 2. So we found the base to be 7, so we substitute the 7 in. 2 times 7 is 14, and 14 plus 2 is 16. So our altitude is 16, and our base is 7.